Hey guys, most people imagine medieval sleep as simple: a quiet room, a wooden bed, maybe a heavy blanket, and darkness settling in for the night. But for many people across medieval Europe, sleep wasn't peaceful at all. It was something closer to a slow, persistent irritation that never really stopped. Before we settle in, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy this kind of calm, thoughtful storytelling, a quick like helps the channel grow in a quiet way. And if you'd like more long, immersive journeys into the past, you're always welcome to subscribe. Now, to understand what it was really like to sleep with fleas in medieval Europe, we have to move away from the image of a still, silent night and step into a world where even rest came with its own small, constant discomforts. Because the first thing to understand is that fleas were not an occasional nuisance. They were part of the environment, as ordinary in many ways as the wood in the walls or the straw beneath a mattress. In a typical medieval home, whether a peasant cottage or even a modest urban dwelling, cleanliness was not defined the way we think of it today. It wasn't about eliminating microscopic threats. It was about managing what could be seen, smelled, and physically handled. And fleas, despite their persistence, often existed just below that threshold of concern. Most sleeping surfaces were made from materials that unintentionally welcomed them. Mattresses were commonly stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool, materials that held warmth and moisture, creating a comfortable habitat not just for humans, but for small parasitic insects as well. Over time, these fillings would compress, gather dust, and absorb the daily realities of life: sweat, dirt, and the residue of the surrounding environment. And this is where an important misunderstanding begins to fade. It's easy to assume that medieval people simply tolerated fleas because they didn't care. But the reality is more complicated. They did care. They noticed the itching, the irritation, the disruption to sleep. But their options for control were limited, inconsistent, and often temporary. Fleas were also not just human companions. Animals played a central role in their spread. In rural settings, livestock might be kept close to living quarters, especially in colder months. Dogs and cats moved freely in and out of homes. Even in towns, animals were a constant presence. And wherever animals went, fleas followed. So when night fell and people lay down to rest, they were entering a shared space, not just with family members, but with an entire unseen population that had been quietly accumulating throughout the day. The experience itself was rarely dramatic. It wasn't a sudden infestation that overwhelmed the senses. Instead, it was something subtler: a bite here, a small itch there, a disturbance just enough to break the rhythm of sleep. And that rhythm mattered more than we might expect. Medieval sleep was already structured differently from our own. Many people followed what historians sometimes describe as segmented sleep, a pattern of two distinct sleeping periods, separated by a quiet interval in the middle of the night. During that waking period, people might pray, reflect, or simply lie still in the darkness. Now imagine that quiet interval, not as a peaceful pause, but as a moment when the body becomes aware again of small movements on the skin, of persistent itching that had been unnoticed during deeper sleep. It's in these moments that the presence of fleas becomes more tangible. Not overwhelming, but undeniably present. And yet, even here, there's another layer to consider. Because despite this discomfort, sleep still had to happen. People worked long hours, often in physically demanding conditions. Rest was not optional. It was essential. So rather than eliminating the problem entirely, people adapted around it. Various methods were used to reduce the impact of fleas, though few were truly effective in the long term. Bedding might be shaken out, exposed to sunlight, or occasionally replaced. Herbs were sometimes placed within sleeping areas, plants believed to repel insects or at least make the environment less appealing. But these solutions were partial at best. The deeper issue was structural. The materials, the proximity to animals, the limitations of washing and sanitation, all of these factors created a cycle that was difficult to break. Fleas were not an anomaly. They were part of the system. And this brings us to a quiet but important shift in perspective. Because when we think about discomfort in the past, we often imagine it as something people were constantly reacting to. But in many cases, discomfort became normalized, not because it was pleasant, but because it was predictable. A person going to bed in medieval Europe might not have expected perfect rest. They expected a certain level of interruption, a certain texture to the night that included not just darkness and quiet, but also small, persistent sensations that never fully disappeared. This doesn't mean they were indifferent. It means their expectations were different. And over time, those expectations shaped behavior in subtle ways. Sleeping positions, for instance, could be influenced by where bites were most commonly felt. Some people may have preferred to sleep more covered, despite the discomfort of heat, simply to reduce exposed skin. Others might adjust blankets or shift frequently during the night, not consciously thinking about fleas, but responding to the sensations they caused. Even social dynamics played a role in crowded households. Where multiple people might share a bed or sleeping space, the presence of fleas became a shared experience. It wasn't something easily attributed to one individual or one object. It was diffuse, collective, and therefore harder to isolate. And in that sense, it becomes less about a single problem and more about an environment that shaped daily life in ways that are easy to overlook. What's especially interesting is how this quiet discomfort contrasts with the way sleep is often imagined in historical settings. We tend to picture stillness, candlelight fading, a kind of calm descent into rest. But the reality for many was more dynamic. Sleep was not always smooth. It was something that had to be negotiated between the body, the environment, and the small, persistent intrusions that came with it. And as we move further into this world, it becomes clear that fleas were only one part of a much larger pattern. A pattern that reveals just how different the experience of rest really was in a time before modern sanitation, before sealed environments, and before the quiet assumptions we now take for granted about what a good night's sleep is supposed to feel like. And before the quiet assumptions we now take for granted about what a good night's sleep is supposed to feel like. Because once we look more closely, the presence of fleas begins to reveal something deeper, not just about discomfort, but about how people in medieval Europe understood their own bodies, their homes, and the boundaries between the two. At night, those boundaries were especially blurred. A bed was not a sealed, private space. It was porous. Air moved through it. Dust settled into it. The materials inside it, straw, wool, feathers, shifted and aged with every passing day. And within that shifting interior, fleas did not simply arrive from outside. They lived, reproduced, and waited. Their life cycle was well suited to this environment. Eggs could fall deep into the bedding, unnoticed. Larvae could develop in the dark, feeding on organic debris, tiny fragments of skin, bits of dust, the quiet residue of daily life. By the time an adult flea emerged, the bed itself had already become a kind of ecosystem. This is one of the more unsettling realities to consider, that the very place designed for rest was also, in a sense, alive with processes that had nothing to do with human comfort. And yet, people adapted to this in ways that were practical rather than ideal. Morning routines, for instance, often included actions that made sense in this context. Bedding might be shaken out vigorously, not only to remove visible dirt, but to disrupt what could not easily be seen. Mattresses were sometimes lifted, aired, or exposed to sunlight when possible. In wealthier households, servants might take on these tasks regularly, though even then, complete control was difficult. Sunlight, in particular, was understood to have a cleansing effect, not in a scientific sense as we would describe today, but in a more observational way. Things left in the sun tended to feel fresher, less odorous, less active with pests. It was a partial solution, but one that fit within the limits of the time. Still, these efforts rarely eliminated the problem. At best, they reduced it temporarily. And so the experience of night remained shaped by this ongoing negotiation. There is also a quieter psychological dimension to consider. Fleas were not invisible in the way bacteria are. They could be seen, felt, sometimes even caught. Their presence was known, but not always constant. This created a kind of intermittent awareness, moments of calm interrupted by small reminders that the environment was never entirely under control. For some, this may have blended into the background of daily life. But for others, especially in warmer months when flea activity increased, it could become more noticeable, more persistent, and more disruptive to rest. Seasonality, in fact, played an important role. During colder periods, flea populations might decline slightly, slowed by lower temperatures and reduced activity. But in spring and summer, conditions became more favorable. Warmth and humidity supported faster reproduction, and the increased movement of people and animals spread them more easily between households. This meant that the quality of sleep could subtly shift with the seasons, not only because of daylight or temperature, but because of the small, living factors embedded within the home itself. And here, another assumption begins to soften. It's tempting to think of medieval discomfort as extreme and constant, but in reality it often fluctuated. There were better nights and worse nights, periods of relative calm, followed by times when irritation returned more strongly. This variability is important because it suggests that people were not simply enduring a fixed condition. They were responding to changing circumstances, adjusting their habits, and developing a kind of quiet resilience. Clothing, for example, played a subtle role in this nightly experience. Many people did not have specialized sleepwear in the modern sense. They might sleep in a simple shift or in undergarments worn during the day. These garments, like bedding, could harbor fleas, carrying them from one place to another. At the same time, they provided a layer of protection, reducing direct contact with the skin. But this protection came with trade-offs. Heavier or more covering garments could trap heat, making sleep less comfortable in other ways. So once again, the body was negotiating between different forms of discomfort: heat, cold, irritation, without a clear way to eliminate any of them entirely. Even the act of scratching, something so instinctive, takes on a slightly different meaning in this context. Scratching could bring temporary relief, but it also risked breaking the skin, leading to minor infections or prolonged irritation. In an environment where hygiene was limited and medical knowledge was still developing, even small wounds could become problematic. So the body learned, in a sense, to balance its own responses, to endure a certain level of discomfort rather than escalate it into something worse. And within all of this, there is a broader social pattern beginning to emerge, because the presence of fleas was not evenly distributed across society. Wealthier households, with access to better materials, more frequent laundering, and more labor, could reduce their exposure to some extent. Finer fabrics, regularly changed linens, and dedicated sleeping chambers created conditions that were somewhat less favorable to infestations. But even in these environments, fleas were not entirely absent. They might be fewer, less persistent, more manageable, but they remained part of the lived experience. The difference was one of degree, not absolute separation. For the majority of people, however, especially in rural or lower-income urban settings, the conditions that supported fleas were deeply embedded in daily life. Close quarters, limited resources, and constant interaction with animals meant that complete avoidance was rarely possible. And this is where the experience of sleep becomes a window into something larger. It reflects not just personal comfort, but the structure of society itself, how resources were distributed, how homes were built, how daily life was organized. Fleas, in this sense, become a small but revealing detail within a much broader historical landscape. As night settled over a medieval town or village, each household entered its own version of this shared reality. Candles dimmed, fires burned low, people lay down, often exhausted, carrying with them the physical traces of the day, dust, sweat, the closeness of others. And within that quiet, the unseen life of the bed continued its own rhythm, largely indifferent to human intention. It's in this quiet overlap between human need and environmental persistence that the true texture of medieval sleep begins to take shape, not as a single, uniform experience, but as a layered one, a combination of rest and interruption, adaptation and limitation, expectation and reality. And as we follow that texture a little further, it starts to connect with something even more consequential. Because fleas were not only a source of discomfort, but under certain conditions they became part of a much larger and more serious chain of events, one that moved far beyond the bedroom and into the wider currents of medieval life. Because at a certain point, the quiet irritation of a flea bite begins to intersect with something far more serious, something that medieval people themselves could not fully see, but certainly felt in its consequences. Fleas, after all, were not just passengers within the home. They were carriers. In ordinary circumstances, this made little difference. A bite was a bite. Unpleasant, distracting, but manageable. But under the right conditions, particularly in densely populated areas where people, animals, and trade routes converged, fleas became part of a much larger network of transmission. And this is where the story shifts, almost imperceptibly, from the intimate space of the bed to the broader structure of medieval society. Towns and cities in medieval Europe were environments of constant movement. Goods arrived from distant regions. Merchants passed through. Animals were bought, sold, transported, and housed in close proximity to people. Storage spaces held grain, textiles, and other materials that attracted rodents, especially rats. And where rats gathered, fleas followed. The connection between fleas and disease was not understood in the modern sense. There was no concept of bacteria or vectors, but there was an awareness, observational, incomplete, but persistent, that illness could spread in patterns that followed movement, proximity, and contact. People noticed that sickness seemed to cluster in certain places, that it moved along roads, that it appeared suddenly and sometimes vanished just as quickly. From our perspective, we can begin to see how fleas, moving between hosts, might have contributed to these patterns. But for those living at the time, the experience was far less clear. What they experienced instead was uncertainty. A household that had seemed ordinary, its nightly discomforts familiar and manageable, could suddenly become a place of fear, not because the fleas themselves had changed in any visible way, but because the consequences of their presence had become more severe. And yet, even here, it's important to remain grounded in the everyday reality. For most nights, for most people, fleas remained what they had always been: a persistent, low-level intrusion into the act of rest. The connection to larger events was not constant. It was episodic, uneven, and often invisible. This creates an interesting tension. On one hand, the nightly experience of fleas was deeply personal, felt on the skin, disrupting sleep, shaping small behaviors. On the other, those same creatures were part of systems that extended far beyond the individual, linking households to towns, towns to regions, and regions to wider historical developments. And in that sense, the bed becomes something more than a place of rest. It becomes a point of contact between the private and the public, the small and the large. But if we return for a moment to the more immediate experience, the act of lying down, of attempting to sleep, we can see how these larger forces remained mostly hidden. A person settling into bed did not think in terms of transmission networks or unseen carriers. They thought in terms of comfort, warmth, and the need for rest before the next day's labor. And so the nightly routine continued. Blankets were adjusted. Bodies shifted into familiar positions. The sounds of the household quieted. Outside, the environment settled into its own rhythms. Distant animals, the occasional movement of wind or wood. And within that quiet, the body began its gradual descent towards sleep. But unlike the modern expectation of a sealed, controlled environment, this descent was always partial. Small interruptions remained. A sudden itch, a brief movement beneath the fabric, a moment of awareness that pulled the mind back from deeper rest. Sometimes these interruptions were enough to wake a person fully. Other times, they blended into dreams, becoming indistinct, half-remembered sensations that lingered without clarity. Over time, this pattern may have shaped not just the quality of sleep, but the way sleep itself was understood. Instead of expecting a single, uninterrupted block of rest, people experienced sleep as something more fluid, something that could be entered, left, and re-entered over the course of the night. And fleas, in their small way, contributed to that fluidity. They were not the sole cause, but they were part of the texture, a constant, low-level presence that made perfect stillness rare. There is also something revealing in how little direct language survives about this specific experience. Medieval texts speak more often about larger discomforts, more visible problems. Fleas are mentioned, certainly, sometimes in passing, sometimes with irritation or humor, but they are rarely described in detailed, systematic ways. This absence is telling. It suggests that fleas were so common, so embedded in daily life, that they did not always require explanation. They were assumed, understood without needing to be fully articulated. And this is often how the most persistent aspects of an environment function. They become background, until occasionally they do not, because there were moments, perhaps after a particularly warm season, or in a crowded household where conditions had intensified, when the presence of fleas could become more than a background detail. Sleep might be more heavily disrupted, irritation more constant, the small negotiations of the body more noticeable. In such moments, the limits of adaptation became clearer. People might take additional steps, more frequent airing of bedding, more careful attention to clothing, perhaps even temporary changes in sleeping arrangements. But these responses were still constrained by the same underlying conditions. The materials remained the same. The environment remained porous. The presence of animals and the movement of people continued. And so, even as individuals responded, the broader system persisted. It is within this balance between effort and limitation that the experience of medieval sleep with fleas finds its most accurate expression. Not as an extreme, unrelenting misery, but as a steady, recurring challenge that shaped the night in quiet, consistent ways. A challenge that required adjustment, patience, and a certain acceptance of imperfection. And as we continue to follow this thread, it begins to intersect with other aspects of medieval life in ways that are not immediately obvious, because the same conditions that allowed fleas to thrive in the bed were also shaping other parts of the household. Other routines, other expectations, other small details that, taken together, defined what it meant to live and to rest in a world that was never entirely still. Because once you begin to notice those conditions, the porous boundaries of the home, the layered materials of bedding, the constant movement between human and animal spaces, you start to see how fleas were not an isolated problem at all. They were part of a broader pattern that shaped nearly every aspect of domestic life, especially at night. Take, for example, the simple act of preparing a bed. In a modern setting, this is often a quick, almost unconscious routine. Sheets are straightened, pillows arranged, perhaps a blanket adjusted. But in medieval Europe, the process could be more deliberate, and in some cases more revealing. Straw mattresses, in particular, required periodic attention. Over time, the straw inside would break down, compact, and gather debris. It might be replaced, but not frequently. More often, it was redistributed, shifted around to maintain some degree of comfort. This act, simple as it was, also had the unintended effect of disturbing whatever lived within the mattress. For a brief moment, the hidden world inside the bed was brought closer to the surface. It's not difficult to imagine that, during these moments, people became more aware of the presence of fleas, not in an abstract sense, but as something immediate and physical. Quick movement, a fleeting glimpse, the need to brush something away before settling in for the night. And yet, even this awareness did not necessarily lead to a sense of control, because control in this context was always partial. Beds were not isolated objects. They were integrated into the structure of the room. In many homes, especially smaller ones, the sleeping area was not separate from the rest of daily life. Cooking, working, eating, and sleeping all took place within the same space. Smoke from the hearth drifted upward, settling into fabrics. Dust moved freely. Animals might pass through or rest nearby. All of this contributed to an environment in which the bed could not be fully protected from the outside world. Even in larger households, where separate chambers existed, the boundaries were still limited. Doors did not seal tightly. Windows, when present, were often small and not designed to exclude everything. The idea of a completely enclosed, controlled sleeping environment was simply not part of the architectural reality. And so the experience of sleep remained connected to everything else that happened during the day. What's particularly interesting is how this connection shaped not only physical habits, but also expectations. A person lying down at night did not expect to leave the world behind in the way we often do now. The sounds of the household continued. The air carried traces of the day. And the small, persistent presence of fleas was simply another part of that continuity. In this sense, sleep was less of a separate state and more of a transition, a gradual shift within an environment that remained active, even as the body attempted to rest. There's also a quieter, more subtle detail worth noticing. Because fleas tend to prefer certain conditions, warmth, proximity to hosts, areas where movement is limited, they often concentrated in particular parts of the bed or on specific areas of the body. Ankles, legs, and the lower parts of the body were common targets, especially where clothing offered less coverage. Over time, this could create patterns that people recognized, even if they didn't fully understand the cause. Certain positions might feel more comfortable than others. Certain parts of the bed might seem more prone to irritation. A person might shift slightly, almost unconsciously, to avoid a familiar sensation. These small adjustments, repeated night after night, became part of the body's memory. And this is where the experience of fleas becomes less about individual moments and more about accumulated habit. The body learns. It learns how to settle despite discomfort, how to return to sleep after interruption, how to navigate an environment that is not. This kind of learning is quiet, almost invisible. It doesn't appear in written records or formal descriptions, but it shapes behavior in consistent ways, influencing how people move, rest, and respond. At the same time, it's important to recognize that not everyone experienced this in exactly the same way. Children, for instance, may have been more sensitive to these interruptions. Their sleep patterns, already different from adults, could be more easily disturbed. And in crowded households, where multiple people shared a bed, the movements of one person, shifting, scratching, adjusting, could affect others as well. Sleep, in these cases, became a shared experience not only in space but in disruption. One person's discomfort could ripple outward, subtly altering the rest of the group. And yet, This shared environment also meant that responses could be communal. Advice, habits, and small remedies were passed between people. Certain herbs might be recommended, specific routines adopted. These were not formal solutions, but practical ones, ways of managing a problem that was widely understood, even if not fully explained. Some households might sprinkle dried plants into bedding, not because they eliminated fleas entirely, but because they seemed to reduce their presence, or at least make the experience more tolerable. Others might place bedding near the hearth during the day, using heat and smoke in the hope of discouraging insects. Again, these methods reflect a kind of observational knowledge, an understanding built from repeated experience rather than scientific theory. And while they offered some relief, they also highlight the limits of what was possible. Because no matter how carefully a bed was prepared, no matter how many small measures were taken, the underlying conditions remained. The materials, the environment, the constant movement of people and animals, all continued to support the presence of fleas. This creates a kind of quiet persistence. The problem never fully disappears. It recedes, returns, shifts in intensity, but remains part of the background of daily life. And over time, this persistence shapes not just how people sleep, but how they think about sleep. It becomes less about achieving perfect comfort and more about finding a workable balance. Enough rest to continue, enough stability to function. Which brings us, gradually, to another layer of the story. Because as we follow this balance between discomfort and adaptation, we begin to see how it intersects with other, less obvious aspects of medieval life, including ideas about cleanliness, health, and even morality, ideas that, in their own way, influenced how people understood the small, restless presence that shared their beds each night. Because in medieval Europe, the idea of cleanliness was not centered on the elimination of microscopic life, something they could not see, but on balance, order, and the visible condition of the body and home. Cleanliness was often associated with outward appearance, with the removal of dirt that could be felt or smelled, and with the maintenance of social and moral expectations. A person could be considered reasonably clean even while living in an environment where fleas were present, simply because fleas did not necessarily violate those visible standards. This creates a subtle but important distinction. From a modern perspective, the presence of fleas suggests a failure of hygiene. But for many people at the time, it was closer to an unavoidable aspect of daily life, something managed rather than eradicated. And this understanding shaped behavior in ways that are easy to overlook. Bathing, for example, did exist in medieval Europe, but it was not practiced with the same frequency or purpose that we might expect today. In some periods and regions, public bathhouses were common, offering not just cleanliness but also social interaction. In others, bathing was less frequent, influenced by changing cultural attitudes, economic conditions, or concerns about health. Even when people bathed, however, it did not necessarily remove fleas in a lasting way. Clothing, bedding, and the environment itself could reintroduce them almost immediately. So while washing the body might provide temporary relief, it was only one part of a much larger cycle. This helps explain why so much attention was placed on managing clothing and fabrics. Garments were often aired out, brushed, or shaken in ways that mirrored the treatment of bedding. Layers of clothing could act as both protection and, at times, as carriers, holding fleas within their folds during the day and bringing them into the bed at night. And here again, the boundaries between spaces begin to dissolve. The day does not end cleanly at night. It continues, carried into the bed through fabric, through the body, through the small, persistent life that moves between them. There is also a moral dimension that quietly overlays all of this. In some contexts, physical discomfort, including that caused by fleas, could be interpreted through a spiritual lens. Endurance, patience, and acceptance of hardship were often valued qualities. Minor irritations, while not desirable, could be folded into a broader understanding of life as something that required resilience. This did not mean people welcomed discomfort, but it did mean that discomfort could be given meaning, rather than being seen purely as a problem to be solved. In this way, the nightly experience of fleas could become part of a larger framework, one that connected the physical body to ideas about discipline, humility, and the limits of human control. At the same time, it's important not to overstate this perspective. People still sought relief where they could find it. Various substances were used in attempts to repel fleas, powders, oils, or herbal mixtures applied to the body or placed within bedding. Some of these may have had mild effects, altering scent or creating less hospitable conditions. Others likely did little more than offer a sense of action, a way of responding to a problem that could not be fully resolved. There were also more direct methods. Fleas could be caught, crushed, removed by hand. This was not a pleasant task, but it was a practical one. It required attention, patience, and a willingness to engage directly with the source of irritation. And this, too, becomes part of the story, because it reminds us that the experience of fleas was not entirely passive. It involved interaction, response, small, repeated acts of management that took place alongside all the other routines of daily life. Over time, these acts accumulated. They became habits, almost invisible in their repetition, but essential to maintaining a certain level of comfort. And yet, even with all of these efforts, the broader conditions remained unchanged. Which brings us back once again to the environment itself. Floors, for instance, were often made of packed earth or rough wood. In some homes, rushes or straw were spread across the floor, serving as a kind of primitive covering. These materials, like bedding, could trap organic matter and provide shelter for insects. They were periodically replaced, but not always as frequently as might be needed to fully disrupt the life cycles of pests. So the entire room, not just the bed, could become part of the same system. Fleas could move between floor and mattress, between clothing and bedding, between animal and human. There was no clear boundary to contain them. This fluid movement is important because it reinforces the idea that sleep, in this context, was never isolated. It was embedded in a living environment, one that continued to function even as the body attempted to rest. And within that environment, certain times and conditions could subtly alter the experience. After a long day of labor, for example, the body might be more inclined to fall quickly into deeper sleep, temporarily overriding minor irritations. On other nights, when rest came more slowly, those same irritations might feel more pronounced, more difficult to ignore. Illness, fatigue, emotional strain. All of these could influence how the presence of fleas was perceived. What remained constant was not the level of discomfort, but the need to navigate it. And as we follow this navigation a little further, another layer begins to emerge, one that connects the experience of fleas not just to the home, but to movement beyond it. Because people did not remain in a single place. They traveled between villages into towns, along roads that connected distant regions. They carried with them their clothing, their habits, and, often unknowingly, the small companions that lived within the folds of fabric and the seams of bedding. Inns, for example, provided a place to rest, but not necessarily a clean break from these conditions. Beds were shared by many travelers over time. Bedding was reused. The environment reflected the constant turnover of people and animals. In such places, the presence of fleas could be even more pronounced, shaped by the accumulation of many different sources. And so, the experience of lying down in an unfamiliar bed did not always bring relief. In some cases, it may have introduced new discomforts, new variations of the same persistent problem. This movement of people, of materials, of small living creatures creates a network that extends far beyond the individual household. It links private experiences to public spaces, local routines to regional patterns. And as we continue to trace that network, it begins to reveal connections that are not immediately visible, connections that tie the quiet irritation of a single night's sleep to the broader rhythms of medieval life, where even the smallest details could travel, accumulate, and shape the world in ways that only become clear when we look closely enough. Because once those connections are visible, even in outline, the experience of something as small as a flea bite begins to feel less isolated. It becomes part of a chain, quiet, largely unnoticed, but continuous. A person leaving their home at dawn, for instance, carried more than tools or goods. Their clothing, worn repeatedly with limited washing, held traces of their environment. Fibers, dust, and occasionally insects moved with them, crossing thresholds that were otherwise invisible. When they entered another home, or an inn, or a shared sleeping space, those traces did not simply disappear. They settled in the seams of bedding, in the corners of wooden frames, in the layered materials that made up mattresses and floor coverings. Over time, these small deposits accumulated, blending with what was already present. And this is how environments began to resemble one another, not in appearance but in structure. Different households, different regions, even different social classes, all developed similar underlying conditions, shaped by the same materials, the same rhythms of life, and the same limitations. Fleas moved easily within this shared structure. They did not respect boundaries of ownership or status. They followed warmth, movement, and opportunity. A well-maintained bed might reduce their numbers, but it could not fully prevent their arrival. And so, across medieval Europe, a kind of quiet continuity emerged. Not uniform, not identical, but connected. A traveler might notice differences between places, the arrangement of a room, the quality of the bedding, the presence of servants, or the absence of them. But the underlying experience of sleep remained familiar in certain ways. There was always the possibility of interruption, always the need to settle, to adjust, to accept a certain level of imperfection. In this sense, fleas contributed to a shared baseline of experience that crossed regional and social lines. But this baseline was not static. It shifted over time, influenced by changes in climate, population, and movement. Periods of increased trade, for example, brought more goods and more people into contact with one another. Markets expanded. Routes became more active. Towns grew denser. With this growth came new layers of complexity. More goods meant more storage. More storage meant more places for rodents to inhabit. And where rodents went, fleas often followed, moving between hosts with little resistance. At the same time, urban environments introduced new patterns of living. Houses were built closer together. Streets narrowed. Waste accumulated in ways that were difficult to manage with the tools available at the time. The boundaries between public and private space became even more fluid. All of this contributed to conditions that could support larger, more persistent populations of insects. And yet, daily life continued. People still worked, traded, traveled, and returned home at the end of the day, carrying with them the same small companions that had become part of the environment. This continuity is important because it reminds us that historical change does not always arrive as a sudden break. It often builds gradually through the accumulation of small factors that, over time, begin to interact in new ways. Fleas, in their quiet persistence, were one of those factors. They linked places together not by intention, but by movement. They moved through clothing, through bedding, through the shared spaces of inns and homes. They adapted to the same conditions that people did, finding ways to survive within the structures that defined medieval life. And in doing so, they became part of a larger pattern, one that connected the most intimate moments of rest to the wider networks of society. There is also something revealing in how people responded to unfamiliar sleeping environments. A traveler entering an inn might carry certain expectations about comfort, about safety, about rest. But those expectations were often tempered by experience. Beds might be inspected briefly, bedding adjusted, perhaps even shaken if time allowed. These small actions reflect a kind of practical awareness, a recognition that not all sleeping spaces were equal, and that some preparation could make a difference. But again, the difference was usually one of degree. The underlying conditions remained. And so, sleep in these transient spaces became an extension of the same pattern found at home, a negotiation between need and environment. What changes, however, is the level of control. At home, a person could develop routines, adjust their bedding, become familiar with the particular rhythms of their environment. In an inn or shared space, that familiarity was absent. The body encountered a new arrangement, a different balance of materials and conditions, and had to adapt more quickly. This could make the presence of fleas feel more noticeable, more immediate, not necessarily because there were more of them, but because the environment was less predictable. And unpredictability, even in small forms, has a way of sharpening awareness. A familiar irritation can fade into the background. An unfamiliar one tends to stand out. So the experience of sleep while traveling might carry a slightly different quality. Less settled, more alert, even within the same general conditions. This, too, becomes part of the broader picture, because it shows how the experience of fleas was not just about their presence, but about the relationship between the body and its surroundings. A relationship that could shift depending on context, familiarity, and expectation. And as we continue to follow that relationship, it begins to intersect with another, more subtle aspect of medieval life, the way people understood the limits of control itself. Because in a world where so much remained beyond immediate influence, weather, harvests, illness, and even the smallest creatures within the home, there was a constant negotiation between what could be managed and what had to be endured. Fleas, in their persistence, sat quietly within that boundary. They were small enough to be addressed, but not fully removed. Present enough to be noticed, but not always severe enough to demand drastic action. And it is within that narrow space, between action and acceptance, that the nightly experience of sleep in medieval Europe continued to unfold, gradually revealing how even the smallest, most ordinary details were woven into the larger fabric of life, shaping habits, expectations, and the quiet rhythm of each passing night. And within that rhythm, something else begins to emerge. Something less visible than the flea itself, but just as influential over time. Because when discomfort becomes regular, even if it is mild, it begins to shape how the body anticipates rest. A person lying down in a medieval bed was not entering a space of complete stillness. There was often a subtle expectation, almost built into the act itself, that the night would include moments of disturbance. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but present. This expectation changes how sleep begins. Instead of surrendering fully to rest, the body remains, in a very slight way, alert. Not awake, but not entirely at ease either. It is a kind of partial vigilance, just enough to respond to sensation, just enough to shift position when needed. Over time, this creates a different relationship with the night. Sleep becomes something that is entered carefully, maintained through adjustment, and occasionally interrupted in ways that feel almost routine. And this is where the experience of fleas starts to overlap with something more subtle, the architecture of sleep itself. Because as we look more closely at medieval sleep patterns, we begin to see that they were not only shaped by light and darkness, but also by the physical conditions of the environment. Segmented sleep, the division of the night into two distinct periods, was not simply a cultural habit. It may also have been reinforced by the reality of interrupted rest. When the body is accustomed to waking briefly, whether from internal rhythms or external sensations, it adapts by treating those awakenings as part of the structure of sleep, rather than as a disruption of it. A person might wake, shift, scratch lightly at an irritation, adjust their coverings, and then return to sleep without a sense that anything unusual had occurred. In this way, fleas become integrated into the pattern. Not dominant, not defining, but present enough to influence the flow of the night. There is also a physical memory that develops over time. The body becomes familiar with certain sensations, how they begin, how they fade, how to respond to them without fully waking. This familiarity reduces their impact, even if it does not eliminate them. It's a kind of quiet adaptation, one that operates below conscious awareness. And yet, it is not perfect. There are always nights when the balance shifts. Warmer air, increased activity, a change in bedding. Any of these can alter the experience. The same environment that felt manageable one night may feel more intrusive the next. And this unpredictability adds another layer to the experience of rest. Because it means that sleep is not only shaped by habit, but also by variation. A person cannot rely entirely on routine. They must remain, in some sense, responsive to changing conditions. This responsiveness is subtle, but it is constant, and it extends beyond the individual to the household as a whole. In shared sleeping spaces, the movements of one person can influence the rest. A shift in position, a brief wakefulness, even the sound of fabric being adjusted. These small actions ripple outward, creating a collective rhythm that is slightly uneven, slightly dynamic. Sleep, in this context, is not entirely private. It is experienced alongside others, influenced by their presence, their movements, and their own responses to the same environment. Fleas, moving between bodies and bedding, become part of this shared experience. They do not belong to one person or another. They exist within the space itself, affecting everyone to varying degrees. This shared condition may have shaped social expectations in ways that are difficult to trace directly, but easy to imagine. A certain tolerance for minor disturbance. An understanding that perfect stillness was neither expected nor required. A quiet acceptance that rest could include interruption without being considered failure. These are small shifts in perspective, but they matter. They define what counts as a normal night. And once something is considered normal, it changes how it is experienced. A modern sleeper, encountering even a minor irritation, might interpret it as a problem. Something to be fixed, removed, corrected. But in a medieval context, the same irritation might simply be part of the landscape of sleep. Not ideal, but expected. This difference in expectation shapes the emotional response. Less frustration, perhaps. Less urgency. More adaptation. But adaptation does not mean indifference. There are moments when the body resists, when the irritation becomes too persistent, when sleep feels just out of reach. In those moments, the quiet balance breaks, and the presence of fleas becomes more noticeable, more intrusive. A person might sit up briefly, brush at their skin, adjust their position more deliberately. The act is small, almost automatic, but it reflects a threshold being crossed. These thresholds are important because they mark the limits of adaptation. They show where tolerance ends and response begins. And over time, they contribute to a kind of practical knowledge, an understanding of how much discomfort can be absorbed and when it must be addressed. This knowledge is not written down. It is learned through experience, repeated night after night. And it becomes part of how people move through their environment, not only during sleep, but throughout the day. Because the effects of interrupted rest do not end when morning comes. They carry forward. A slightly reduced sense of energy, a subtle heaviness in the body, perhaps a greater reliance on routine to maintain focus and stability. These effects are rarely dramatic. They do not define a person's entire day, but they accumulate, shaping the overall texture of life in ways that are easy to overlook. And when we begin to see that accumulation, the role of fleas becomes more significant. Not as a singular cause, but as one of many small factors that influenced how people lived, worked, and rested. This perspective also helps explain why certain changes, when they eventually arrived, had such a noticeable impact. Because when the conditions that supported fleas began to shift, through improvements in materials, in building design, in the management of living spaces, the experience of sleep changed as well. But those changes did not happen all at once. They emerged gradually, unevenly, and often in response to pressures that extended far beyond the bedroom. And as we follow those pressures further, they begin to lead us into another part of the story, one where the same networks that carried fleas between homes also carried ideas, practices, and innovations. Small changes that, over time, would begin to alter the very conditions that had once made a restless night feel almost inevitable. But those changes did not begin with comfort in mind. They began, more often, with necessity. As medieval towns grew and trade routes became more active, people were drawn into closer and more frequent contact, not just with one another, but with unfamiliar environments, unfamiliar goods, and unfamiliar problems. The movement that had once been occasional became more regular, and with that regularity came a gradual awareness that certain conditions seemed to follow people wherever they went. Not just fleas themselves, but the broader discomforts that accompanied them. And in response, small adjustments began to appear, rare at first and often limited to specific regions or social groups, but noticeable when viewed over time. One of the earliest of these shifts can be seen in the materials used for sleeping. Straw remained common for a long time, especially among the majority of the population. It was accessible, replaceable, and relatively easy to work with, but it also had clear limitations. It broke down quickly, trapped moisture, and provided an ideal environment for insects. So in some households, particularly wealthier ones, alternative fillings became more desirable. Feathers, for instance, offered a different kind of surface, softer, more flexible, and less prone to the same kind of compacting that straw experienced. Wool, too, provided warmth and resilience. These materials were not immune to infestation, but they could be managed in slightly different ways. They could be removed, aired, and, in some cases, replaced more selectively. These changes did not eliminate fleas, but they shifted the balance. They made certain aspects of sleep more controllable, even if only by a small margin. At the same time, attention began to turn more deliberately toward the structure of the bed itself. Raised bed frames, which had already existed in various forms, became more significant, not simply as markers of status, but as practical tools. Elevating the sleeping surface above the ground created a subtle separation between the body and the floor, reducing some of the pathways through which insects could travel. Curtains, too, began to appear more frequently around beds in certain contexts. While often associated with warmth and privacy, they may also have served an additional function, creating a partial barrier, however imperfect, between the sleeper and the surrounding environment. These developments were not universal. They appeared unevenly, influenced by wealth, geography, and local traditions. But taken together, they represent a gradual shift in how people thought about the sleeping space, not just as a place to rest, but as something that could be shaped, adjusted, and, to a limited extent, controlled. And yet, even as these changes emerged, the underlying conditions remained. Homes were still porous. Materials still aged and absorbed the traces of daily life. Animals still moved between spaces. And fleas, adaptable as ever, continued to find ways to persist within these evolving environments. This creates an important tension, because it shows that progress in this context was not a clean break from the past. It was a layering of new practices onto old structures, an ongoing process of adjustment rather than a single moment of transformation. And within that process, people continued to rely on the same core strategies they had always used: observation, adaptation, and repetition. There is also something else happening during this period, something quieter but equally significant. As knowledge moved along the same routes as goods and people, ideas about managing the environment began to circulate more widely. Not in a formal scientific sense, but through shared experience. A traveler might notice that bedding in one region was treated differently than in another, that certain herbs were used more commonly in one place than elsewhere, that some households seemed to maintain a slightly higher level of comfort, even within the same general conditions. These observations, carried from place to place, contributed to a slow accumulation of practical knowledge. What worked, even slightly, was remembered. What failed was quietly set aside. Over time, this created a kind of informal network of improvement, small, incremental changes that spread through communities without ever being fully standardized. And yet, even as these improvements took hold, the experience of fleas remained. Less overwhelming in some cases, more manageable in others, but still present. This persistence is revealing, because it highlights the limits of change in a world where so many variables remained beyond immediate control. Climate, for example, continued to play a decisive role. A warm season could undo months of careful management. A damp environment could encourage the return of conditions that had seemed temporarily improved. The same materials that offered comfort also retained the elements that allowed insects to survive. So the balance shifted again and again, and people adjusted again and again in response. This ongoing cycle of change, adaptation, and return shaped not only the physical experience of sleep, but also the expectations surrounding it. Comfort became something relative, not absolute. A bed that felt cleaner, softer, or less active than another was considered an improvement, even if it still fell short of what we might now consider restful. And this relative improvement carried its own quiet significance, because it marked the beginning of a new way of thinking about the domestic environment, not as something entirely given, but as something that could be gradually refined. This shift did not happen all at once, and it did not eliminate the presence of fleas. But it did begin to change the relationship between people and their surroundings. Instead of simply enduring, there was a growing sense, however limited, that certain aspects of life could be shaped over time. And as that sense developed, it began to influence other parts of the household as well. Attention to ventilation, to the arrangement of furniture, to the handling of fabrics and storage. All of these details, small on their own, contributed to a broader pattern of awareness. A pattern that, slowly and unevenly, began to reshape the conditions in which people lived and slept. But even as this awareness expanded, it remained grounded in the same practical reality. Fleas were still there. They still moved through the same pathways, still responded to the same conditions, still occupied the same hidden spaces within the home. The difference was not their absence, but the gradual shift in how their presence was managed. And it is within that shift, between persistence and adaptation, that the next part of the story begins to take form. Because as these small improvements accumulated, they started to intersect with larger changes in society, changes that would eventually alter not just how people slept, but how they understood the very idea of comfort itself. Because once comfort begins to be seen as something that can change, something that can be improved even slightly, it starts to shift expectations in ways that are almost invisible at first. A bed that feels a little cleaner than it did before. A night with fewer interruptions. A household where small measures seem to make a difference. These are not dramatic transformations, but they introduce a new possibility. That the experience of rest does not have to remain exactly as it has always been. And that possibility, once introduced, tends to expand. It encourages attention. People begin to notice more. Not just the presence of fleas, but the conditions that seem to affect them. Which rooms feel more comfortable. Which materials hold less moisture. Which arrangements allow for better airflow, even if they cannot fully explain why. This attention is practical, grounded in experience rather than theory. A window left slightly open during the day might seem to freshen a room. Bedding exposed to sunlight might feel less active at night. Garments that are rotated or aired more frequently might carry fewer irritations into the bed. None of these observations are precise. They are not systematized, but they accumulate. And as they accumulate, they begin to form a kind of quiet knowledge, a sense that certain habits, repeated over time, can shape the environment in small but meaningful ways. This is where the story takes on a slightly different character. Because while fleas remain present, the focus begins to shift toward the conditions that allow them to thrive. Moisture, warmth, stagnation, these become factors that people respond to, even if they do not fully articulate them in those terms. Rooms that feel damp are less comfortable not only because of the air itself, but because they seem to support more persistent irritation. Spaces that remain enclosed for long periods may develop a kind of heaviness, a sense that the air is not moving, that something is settling within it. And in response, subtle adjustments begin to appear. Openings are used more deliberately. Items are moved, repositioned, exposed. The rhythm of the household begins to include moments of airing, of lifting, of allowing the environment to reset itself, however briefly. These actions do not eliminate fleas, but they change the texture of the environment. They introduce variation where there might otherwise be stasis. And variation, even in small amounts, can disrupt patterns that would otherwise remain constant. There is also an emerging distinction between spaces within the home. In earlier contexts, the sleeping area was often indistinguishable from the rest of the room. But as expectations shift, even slightly, there is a growing tendency to treat the bed as something more specific, something that can be arranged, maintained, and, to a degree, protected. This does not always mean physical separation. Walls remain the same. Rooms remain multifunctional. But the idea of a designated sleeping space begins to take on more significance. A bed might be positioned differently, away from drafts or from areas of heavy movement. It might be kept more carefully, adjusted more regularly. The attention given to it reflects its importance, not just as a place to lie down, but as a place where the quality of rest can be influenced. And with that attention comes a subtle shift in how discomfort is interpreted. If conditions can be improved, even slightly, then persistent discomfort begins to stand out more. Not as something entirely new, but as something that contrasts with the possibility of better rest. This contrast is important because it changes the emotional tone of the experience. Where once irritation might have been accepted as part of the landscape, it now begins to feel, at times, like something that could be reduced, managed more effectively, perhaps even minimized under the right conditions. But here again, the limits of the environment assert themselves. Because even as expectations shift, the fundamental constraints remain. Materials still absorb moisture. Animals still move through shared spaces. Clothing still carries the traces of the day. And fleas, resilient and adaptable, continue to inhabit the same hidden layers of the home. So the experience becomes one of contrast. Better nights and worse nights. Spaces that feel more comfortable and others that do not. Periods when the balance leans toward rest, and others when it tips back toward irritation. And within this shifting balance, people continue to adapt. They refine their habits. They adjust their routines. They develop a more nuanced sense of what works and what does not, even if they cannot fully explain why. This refinement is gradual, almost imperceptible from one generation to the next. But over time, it begins to accumulate into something more substantial. A household, for instance, might adopt a set of practices that, taken together, create a slightly more stable environment. Bedding is handled in a particular way. Clothing is managed with a certain rhythm. Spaces are used with an awareness, however informal, of how they affect comfort. These practices are not universal. They vary from place to place, shaped by local conditions and available resources. But they share a common thread: an increasing attention to the relationship between environment and rest. And as this attention deepens, it begins to intersect with other areas of life. Craftsmanship, for example, plays a role. The way a bed is constructed, the materials chosen, the way fabrics are woven and finished, all of these influence how the sleeping environment behaves over time. A tighter weave might hold fewer particles. A smoother surface might be easier to maintain. A more solid frame might reduce the accumulation of debris in certain areas. These are small differences, but they matter. They contribute to a gradual evolution in the physical objects that make up the home. At the same time, economic factors begin to influence access to these improvements. Not everyone can afford better materials or more frequent replacement of bedding. Not every household has the space or the resources to rearrange its environment in optimal ways. So the experience of sleep, and the presence of fleas within it, continues to vary. For some, the balance shifts toward greater comfort, even if only slightly. For others, it remains much the same, shaped by the same constraints that have always been there. And yet, across these differences, the underlying pattern continues. People observe, they adjust, they carry forward what seems to work. And through this process, the environment itself begins to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but through the accumulation of small, consistent choices. Which brings us, gradually, to another turning point in the story. Because as these choices begin to spread, they intersect with larger developments, changes in trade, in knowledge, in the movement of goods and ideas, that will begin to reshape the conditions of everyday life in more noticeable ways. And within those changes, the quiet presence of fleas, still persistent, still woven into the fabric of the home, will begin to take on a slightly different meaning, as part of a world that is, slowly but unmistakably, beginning to shift. And as that shift gathers pace, something else begins to change alongside it. Not just the physical environment, but the way people interpret cause and effect within that environment. Because for much of the medieval period, the relationship between discomfort and its source remained indirect. A person might feel the irritation of a flea bite, might notice patterns in when it occurred, might even develop habits to reduce it, but the deeper mechanisms behind it remained out of reach. What begins to change gradually is not a sudden discovery, but a slow sharpening of attention. More people are moving between regions. More goods are circulating. And with that movement comes comparison. A traveler who spends time in different towns may begin to notice that certain places feel consistently more comfortable than others. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, repeated observations. A bed that feels less active. A room that seems easier to settle into. A household where sleep, for reasons not entirely clear, feels more stable. These observations do not immediately lead to explanation, but they create questions. Why does one place feel different from another? Why do certain arrangements seem to produce better rest? Why do some environments appear to support fewer disturbances, even when the materials look similar at first glance? And it is within these questions that a subtle shift begins. People start to connect patterns more deliberately. They notice that spaces with more air movement tend to feel less oppressive. That bedding handled more frequently, lifted, aired, exposed, seems to carry fewer irritations into the night. That materials which remain dry and less compacted behave differently over time. Again, these are not scientific conclusions. They are practical associations, built from repeated experience. But they matter, because they begin to change behavior in more consistent ways. Instead of occasional adjustments, certain practices become more regular. Bedding is aired not just when it feels necessary, but as part of a routine. Spaces are opened, when possible, to allow air and light to move through them. Clothing is managed with a greater awareness of how it interacts with the body and the bed. These changes remain uneven. They do not reach every household, nor do they produce uniform results. But they represent a gradual refinement, a movement toward environments that are, in small ways, more stable. And as stability increases, even slightly, it reveals something else. It reveals contrast. A person who has experienced a somewhat improved environment, however modest, becomes more aware when that improvement is absent. A night that feels more restless than usual stands out more clearly against the memory of a better one. This contrast sharpens perception. It makes the presence of fleas and the conditions that support them more noticeable, not because they are new, but because they are now being compared against something different. And this comparison feeds back into the cycle of observation and adjustment. People refine their habits further. They pay closer attention to the details of their environment. They begin, in subtle ways, to take a more active role in shaping the conditions of their rest. But here, once again, the limits of the system remain visible. Because no matter how carefully a household manages its bedding, its clothing, its space, it is still connected to a wider world. Fleas do not originate solely within a single home. They move through networks, through trade, through travel, through the constant exchange of goods and materials. A well-maintained bed can be reintroduced to the same conditions through a single garment, a shared space, or a visiting traveler. And so the balance is never fully secure. This creates a kind of tension between local control and external influence. A household might achieve a certain level of comfort, only to find it altered by factors beyond its immediate reach. The environment is not closed. It is part of a larger system that continues to shift, regardless of individual effort. This realization, even if not fully articulated, shapes expectations. People come to understand that comfort is conditional, can be improved, but not guaranteed, managed, but not perfected. And this understanding influences not only behavior, but also attitude. There is a certain patience that develops, a recognition that improvement is gradual, that setbacks are part of the process, that the environment itself is something that must be worked with rather than fully controlled. At the same time, these gradual improvements begin to intersect with broader developments in material culture. Textiles, for instance, begin to change. As trade expands, new fabrics and techniques become available. Weaving becomes more refined. Certain materials are produced with greater consistency, greater density, or smoother finishes. These changes affect not only appearance and durability, but also how fabrics interact with the environment. A tighter weave may hold less dust. A smoother surface may be easier to clean or air. These are small differences, but they accumulate. They alter the way bedding behaves over time. They influence how easily it can be maintained, how it responds to moisture, how it feels against the skin. And in doing so, they subtly reshape the experience of sleep. At the same time, furniture itself continues to evolve. Bed frames become more varied, more deliberately constructed. Storage spaces are designed with greater attention to how materials are kept and preserved. The arrangement of rooms, even within the same structural limits, begins to reflect a growing awareness of how space influences daily life. These changes are not universal, and they do not eliminate the presence of fleas, but they contribute to a gradual rebalancing. An environment that once felt entirely given begins to feel, in certain respects, adjustable. And this adjustment, even when partial, changes the relationship between people and their surroundings. It introduces a sense, quiet, incremental, that conditions can be shaped over time. And yet, for all of these developments, the nightly experience remains recognizably the same in its essentials. Person lies down. The body settles. The environment continues its subtle activity. And within that activity, the small, persistent presence of fleas remains. Less dominant in some cases, more manageable in others, but still woven into the fabric of the night. What has changed is not their existence, but the context in which they are experienced. They are no longer simply part of an unchanging landscape. They exist within a world that is beginning slowly to respond. And as that response grows, through movement, through exchange, through the accumulation of small improvements, it begins to set the stage for something more noticeable, a shift not just in how people manage discomfort, but in how they begin to imagine a life where that discomfort might eventually be reduced even further. And it is at this point that the story becomes less about the flea itself and more about the changing relationship between people and the spaces they inhabit. Because once the idea takes hold, however faintly, that discomfort can be lessened, even in small ways, it begins to influence not just habits, but intentions. A bed is no longer simply assembled from what is available. It is increasingly arranged with a purpose. Layers are considered. Materials are chosen, when possible with an awareness, however informal, of how they behave over time. A mattress that can be opened, adjusted, or partially replaced becomes more valuable than one that simply endures. This does not mean that most people suddenly gained access to better resources. Far from it. For many, especially in rural or lower-income settings, the same constraints remained firmly in place. But even within those constraints, intention matters. A person might turn their mattress more regularly, shift its contents with greater care, pay closer attention to where it is placed within the room. These actions are small, almost unremarkable, but they reflect a growing sense that the environment is not entirely fixed. And this sense begins to spread beyond the bed. Storage practices, for example, take on a slightly different character. Clothing is not only kept for use, but also managed with an awareness of how it interacts with the body and the environment. Garments that are worn repeatedly without airing may carry more than just visible dirt. They carry the conditions of the day into the night. So they are shaken, hung, sometimes rotated, not always consistently, not always effectively, but with a growing recognition that these actions have consequences. This recognition extends gradually to the household as a whole. Spaces are observed more closely. Corners where debris gathers are noticed. Areas that feel damp or stagnant are, when possible, adjusted. Light and air, though not fully understood in their effects, are treated as beneficial. Windows, where they exist, are opened when conditions allow. Doors are used not only for access but for movement of air. Objects are rearranged, not just for convenience, but for comfort. These changes are subtle, and they unfold unevenly. But they represent a shift in perspective from living within an environment to, in some measure, shaping it. At the same time, the limitations of this shaping remain ever present. Materials still wear down. Conditions still fluctuate. External influences, weather, travel, trade, continue to introduce variables that cannot be fully controlled. And within all of this, fleas remain remarkably consistent. They adapt to new arrangements. They persist within improved materials. They find new pathways when old ones are disrupted. Their resilience is, in a sense, a constant against which all other changes are measured. And this creates a kind of quiet feedback loop. As people improve their environments even slightly, they become more aware of what remains unchanged. The presence of fleas, once an unremarkable background detail, begins to stand out more clearly in contrast to the improvements around it. This does not mean that fleas become more numerous. It means they become more noticeable. And with that noticeability comes a shift in attention. People begin to look more closely at the conditions that allow fleas to persist. Not in a systematic or scientific way, but in a practical, observational sense. They notice that certain fabrics seem to hold more activity than others. That bedding left undisturbed for long periods becomes more problematic. That environments with less movement, less air, less light, tend to feel more affected. These observations, repeated and shared, contribute to a gradual refinement of practice. And as these practices become more consistent, they begin to influence not only individual households, but communities. A habit adopted in one home may be observed by another. A small improvement once proven useful may be repeated elsewhere. Over time, these patterns spread not through formal instruction, but through imitation and experience. This is how change often occurs in such contexts. Quietly, incrementally, without a single moment of transformation. And yet, even as these changes accumulate, the broader environment continues to exert its influence. Seasonal cycles remain. Warmth and humidity continue to shape conditions. The movement of people and goods continues to introduce variation. And within this interplay, the experience of sleep remains dynamic. Some nights feel more settled, others less so. The balance shifts, sometimes gradually, sometimes unexpectedly. But what has changed is the framework within which these shifts are understood. Discomfort is no longer entirely given. It is, at least in part, something that can be influenced. And this understanding, even when limited, has consequences. It encourages persistence. A household that experiences a slight improvement is more likely to repeat the actions that led to it. Over time, these repeated actions become habits. And habits, once established, shape the environment in more consistent ways. This consistency, in turn, creates a new baseline, a slightly higher level of comfort, a slightly more stable environment. Not perfect, not free from interruption, but different enough to be felt. And once that difference is felt, it becomes difficult to ignore. It raises expectations, even if only subtly. It creates a sense that the conditions of life are not entirely fixed, that they can, over time, be adjusted, improved, refined. And as this sense grows, it begins to intersect with other developments taking place across medieval Europe. Changes in trade bring new materials. Shifts in craftsmanship alter the objects within the home. Expanding networks of communication carry not only goods, but ideas, ways of doing things, ways of thinking about space, comfort, and daily life. These broader movements do not eliminate the presence of fleas, but they begin to reshape the environment in which those fleas exist. And in doing so, they alter the experience of sleep in ways that are gradual, uneven, and often difficult to trace in a single moment. Instead, the change unfolds over time, through the accumulation of small adjustments, each one building on the last. And as we continue to follow that unfolding, it leads us toward a period where these incremental changes begin to gather into something more visible, where the quiet efforts of households, repeated across generations, start to intersect with larger transformations that will, eventually, begin to redefine what a night's rest can feel like. And yet, even as those larger transformations slowly take shape, the reality inside most medieval homes remains grounded in something much more immediate. Something that unfolds night after night in small, repeating patterns that rarely announce themselves as change. Because for most people, the shift is not experienced as a clear improvement, but as a series of slight differences. A bed that feels a little less active than it did a year before. A room that holds its air differently. A routine that seems to produce more consistent rest, even if the reason is not entirely understood. These are not dramatic moments. They do not stand out in memory, but they accumulate. And as they do, they begin to alter something deeper than the physical environment. They begin to alter expectation at a more fundamental level. A person who has known only one kind of night, one rhythm of interruption, one texture of discomfort, may not imagine anything different. But a person who has experienced variation, even slight variation, begins to sense that rest can exist on a spectrum, that some nights can be quieter than others, that certain conditions can make the body feel more settled, more at ease, even if only for a time. This awareness, once formed, is difficult to lose. It introduces a subtle form of comparison into the experience of sleep. A person may not be able to eliminate fleas entirely, but they may begin to notice when their presence is reduced. They may begin to recognize the conditions under which rest feels more complete. And in recognizing those conditions, they begin to seek them out. This seeking is quiet. It does not involve dramatic changes or sweeping reforms. It takes the form of small decisions: where to place the bed, when to air the bedding, how to manage clothing at the end of the day. These decisions, repeated over time, create patterns. And patterns, once established, shape the environment in ways that are both subtle and persistent. At the same time, the broader world continues to move. Trade routes expand further. Materials travel longer distances. Techniques of craftsmanship evolve, sometimes slowly, sometimes more rapidly, depending on the region and the resources available. Within this movement, certain materials begin to circulate more widely. Linen, for example, becomes increasingly significant in some contexts, not only for clothing but for bedding. Its properties, its relative smoothness, its ability to be washed and dried more effectively than heavier materials, introduce new possibilities. Again, these possibilities are not universal. Linen is not available to everyone, and even where it is, it does not eliminate the presence of fleas. But it changes the conditions. It allows for a different kind of maintenance, a different rhythm of care, a different relationship between the body and the surface on which it rests. This, in turn, influences how people think about cleanliness, not as a fixed state, but as something that can be approached, maintained, and, to some degree, improved. And as this thinking spreads, it begins to intersect with other developments in subtle ways. Water, for instance, takes on a slightly different role. Not in the sense of frequent bathing as we might imagine today, but in the handling of fabrics, in the occasional washing of garments, in the effort to refresh materials that come into direct contact with the body. These actions are limited by practical constraints, availability of water, time, labor, but they represent another layer of engagement with the environment, another way of responding to the conditions that shape daily life. And within all of this, fleas remain. They adapt to linen as they adapted to wool and straw. They persist within the folds of fabric, within the seams of clothing, within the small, hidden spaces that are difficult to reach. But their presence begins to feel slightly different, not because they are gone, but because the context around them has changed. A bite that might once have gone unnoticed now stands out more clearly against a background of slightly improved comfort. A night that feels more restless than expected becomes more noticeable when better nights have been experienced. This contrast sharpens perception. It draws attention to the details of the environment in new ways, and it encourages further refinement. People adjust again, slightly, carefully, often without fully articulating what they are doing or why. They repeat what seems to work. They abandon what does not. And through this process, the environment continues to shift, not dramatically, but steadily. There is also a growing distinction between permanence and change. Certain aspects of the home remain fixed: the structure of the building, the basic materials available, the presence of animals, and the movement of daily life. But within those fixed elements, there is increasing room for variation. Bedding can be handled differently. Clothing can be managed with more attention. Spaces can be arranged with a slightly greater awareness of how they function. These variations do not eliminate the old conditions, but they begin to overlay them with new possibilities. And it is within this layering that the experience of sleep continues to evolve. Not as a clean transition from discomfort to comfort, but as a gradual rebalancing, a shifting of emphasis, a refinement of habit, a slow movement toward environments that are, in small ways, more responsive to human needs. At the same time, the shared nature of this experience remains. Households still live closely together. Beds are still shared. The rhythms of one person still influence the rest. Fleas still move within these shared spaces, linking individuals through a common condition. But even here, the changes begin to register. A household that adopts certain practices may experience a slightly different rhythm of rest than one that does not. A traveler moving between these households may notice the difference, even if they cannot fully explain it. And in noticing, they carry that awareness with them. They become part of the network through which ideas and practices spread. Not formally, not intentionally, but through observation and imitation. This is how change continues, not through a single moment of realization, but through countless small acts, repeated across time and space. And as these acts accumulate, they begin to intersect more directly with larger transformations, changes in population, in urban structure, in the organization of daily life, that will, in time, begin to reshape the very conditions that once made the presence of fleas feel almost inevitable. But for now, the night remains a place of negotiation, a place where the body settles, adjusts, responds, where the environment continues its quiet activity, and where the small, persistent presence that has followed us through this story still moves, still adapts, still occupies its place within the layered reality of medieval sleep, even as the world around it continues, slowly, to change. And as that change deepens, something else begins to take shape, something less visible than new materials or altered routines, but perhaps more influential over time. A shift in sensitivity. Because when the body becomes accustomed to a certain level of discomfort, it learns to absorb it. But when that level begins even slightly to decrease, the same sensations can start to feel more pronounced. This is a quiet reversal. The flea itself has not become more aggressive. The environment has not been entirely transformed. But the threshold of what feels tolerable has begun to move. A bite that might once have blended into the background now draws a little more attention. A night that feels slightly unsettled becomes more noticeable when compared to one that felt calmer the night before. And this heightened sensitivity does something important. It reinforces the idea that improvement is possible. Even if that improvement is incomplete, even if it fluctuates, the fact that it can be felt at all changes how people relate to their surroundings. They begin to notice more deliberately, not just the presence of fleas, but the patterns that accompany them. When they seem more active, where they seem to gather, which parts of the body are more frequently affected. These observations are still informal, still grounded in experience rather than theory, but they become more detailed, more precise. A person might begin to associate certain types of bedding with more or less irritation. They might notice that nights following a thorough airing of the bed feel different from those when it has been left undisturbed. They might observe that clothing worn for several days without attention seems to carry something into the bed that is difficult to ignore. These associations, repeated over time, begin to form a kind of internal map, a sense of how the environment behaves, how it responds to certain actions, how it changes from one condition to another. And this map, though never written down, becomes a guide. It shapes decisions in small but consistent ways. Where to sit, where to sleep, when to adjust the bedding, how to manage the transition from day to night. At the same time, this growing awareness begins to interact with something else that is changing in the background. The rhythm of work and rest itself. In many parts of medieval Europe, daily life was structured around patterns that were both demanding and repetitive. Physical labor, long hours, seasonal pressures. All of these created a strong need for reliable rest. And when rest becomes more reliable, even slightly, its value becomes clearer. A night that feels more settled leads to a day that feels more manageable. A body that is less disrupted during sleep carries a different kind of energy into the morning. These differences are not dramatic, but they are noticeable. And once noticed, they reinforce the behaviors that produced them. This creates a kind of feedback loop. Improved conditions lead to better rest. Better rest supports clearer awareness. Clearer awareness leads to more refined practices. And those practices, in turn, support further improvement. But as always, the system remains incomplete. Because no matter how carefully a household manages its environment, it remains connected to forces beyond its control. Travelers arrive. Goods are exchanged. Materials move from place to place, carrying with them the conditions of their origin. An item of clothing acquired through trade may introduce new variables into the household. A visitor may bring with them the unseen traces of another environment. A shared space, used by many over time, may accumulate layers of influence that no single person can fully manage. And within this network, fleas continue to move. They pass from one context to another, adapting to new conditions, persisting through change. Their presence becomes a kind of constant within a shifting landscape. And it is this constancy that makes them so revealing, because they highlight the limits of individual control within a connected world. A person may refine their habits, improve their environment, reduce their discomfort, but they cannot fully isolate themselves from the broader system in which they live. This understanding, even if not fully articulated, shapes expectations in subtle ways. It encourages a balance between effort and acceptance, an awareness that improvement is possible, but not absolute, that comfort can be approached, but not fully secured. And within this balance, the experience of sleep continues to evolve. It becomes, increasingly, something that is shaped by intention as well as by circumstance. A person prepares for the night with a certain awareness of what has worked before, of what might improve the conditions, of how to navigate the environment they inhabit. They adjust their bedding. They manage their clothing. They settle into a position that feels, for the moment, most stable. And then, gradually, they allow the body to rest. Not in perfect stillness, not in complete isolation from the world, but within a space that has been shaped, however imperfectly, by their own actions. And within that space, the small, persistent movements of fleas continue. Less dominant, perhaps, in some contexts, more noticeable in others, but always present, always adapting. What has changed is the relationship between those movements and the person experiencing them. They are no longer entirely unexpected. They are part of a pattern, one that the body has learned to anticipate, to respond to incorporate into the broader rhythm of sleep. And as this relationship continues to shift, it begins to intersect more directly with changes that are unfolding on a larger scale. Because the same networks that carry fleas through trade, through travel, through shared spaces, are also carrying something else. New ideas about materials, new approaches to managing space, new ways of thinking about the connection between the body and its environment. These ideas do not arrive all at once. They spread slowly, unevenly, shaped by the same constraints that define daily life. But over time, they begin to accumulate. And as they do, they create the conditions for a more noticeable transformation, one that will not eliminate the small, restless presence we have been following, but will begin to alter the world in which it exists in ways that are increasingly difficult to ignore. And it is within that growing transformation that the next stage of this story begins to unfold, as the quiet, persistent negotiation between discomfort and adaptation starts to give way, in certain places and at certain moments, to something closer to deliberate change. And that shift from quiet adaptation to more intentional adjustment does not arrive with a clear beginning. It emerges gradually, almost imperceptibly, as small decisions begin to carry a different kind of weight. Because once people start to believe, even faintly, that their environment can be shaped, their actions begin to follow that belief more consistently. A bed is no longer simply maintained when it becomes uncomfortable. It is tended to in anticipation of discomfort. Bedding is aired not only after it feels stale, but before it reaches that point. Clothing is managed with a growing awareness that what is worn during the day will influence the quality of the night. This is a subtle but important change. It shifts the relationship with the environment from reactive to proactive. And within that shift, the presence of fleas begins to take on a slightly different role. They are no longer only something to respond to after the fact. They become part of the reasoning behind certain actions, part of the quiet logic that shapes daily routines. A person might not articulate this directly. They may not say in explicit terms that they are managing fleas. But the habits they develop, how they handle bedding, how they rotate garments, how they use light and air, are increasingly aligned with reducing the conditions that allow those small disturbances to persist. This alignment creates a kind of rhythm. Daily life begins to include moments of preparation that extend beyond immediate needs. The act of opening a window, of lifting a mattress, of hanging a garment, these become part of a broader pattern of care, one that connects day and night more deliberately. And as this rhythm becomes more established, it begins to influence how space itself is perceived. Rooms are no longer just places where activities happen. They are environments with qualities, some more favorable than others. A room that feels dry and well-aired is not simply comfortable. It is preferable. A space that feels enclosed, heavy, or stagnant is not only unpleasant. It is something to be adjusted, if possible. This awareness, once again, is not universal. It varies by region, by wealth, by access to materials and space. But where it does take hold, it begins to reshape the way households function. Furniture is positioned with greater care. Openings are used more deliberately. Items are stored in ways that reflect not just convenience, but an understanding, however incomplete, of how conditions develop over time. And within all of this, fleas continue to move, to adapt, to persist. But their presence is now met with a different kind of attention. Not just acceptance, not just occasional response, but a more consistent effort to influence the environment in which they exist. This effort is not always successful. There are still nights when the balance shifts. When warmth increases, when activity rises, when the small, persistent movements within the bed become more noticeable again. But even in those moments, the response is different. A person who has developed certain habits does not begin from nothing. They return to those habits. They adjust. They repeat what has worked before. And over time, this repetition creates a kind of stability, not absolute but meaningful. A household may come to experience a more consistent pattern of rest, even if it is still imperfect. The fluctuations become less extreme, the interruptions less frequent or at least more predictable. And predictability in this context has its own value. It allows the body to settle more easily. It reduces the sense of uncertainty that can accompany unfamiliar conditions. It creates a baseline from which further adjustments can be made. At the same time, this growing stability begins to reveal something else. Because as conditions improve, even slightly, the differences between households become more noticeable. A traveler moving between environments may begin to perceive a clearer contrast. One place feels more settled, another more restless. One bed offers a more consistent surface, another shifts and disturbs. These contrasts do not go unnoticed. They become part of the broader exchange of experience. Shared in conversation, observed in passing, carried from one place to another. And through this exchange, practices continue to spread. Not formally, not systematically, but through imitation and adaptation. A method observed in one household may be tried in another. A material encountered in a different region may be adopted where possible. A habit that produces a slight improvement may be repeated, refined, and eventually integrated into daily life. This is how deliberate change begins to take hold. Not as a single, coordinated effort, but as a network of small decisions, each one shaped by experience, each one contributing to a gradual transformation of the environment. And as this network expands, it begins to intersect more directly with larger developments. Urban spaces, for example, continue to grow. As towns become more densely populated, the management of space becomes more complex. The need to maintain certain conditions, airflow, cleanliness, separation of activities, becomes more apparent, even if it cannot always be fully achieved. In response, new arrangements begin to appear. Sleeping spaces are, in some cases, set apart more clearly from areas of heavy activity. Storage becomes more organized. The flow of movement within a household is adjusted to reduce the accumulation of debris and stagnation in certain areas. These changes are gradual and uneven, but they reflect a growing awareness that the organization of space matters. That how a home is arranged can influence not just comfort, but the presence and persistence of the small, unseen elements within it. And within this evolving structure, the experience of sleep continues to shift. Not in a single direction, not toward a clear endpoint, but through a series of adjustments that slowly redefine what is considered normal. A night with fewer interruptions becomes something to be expected, rather than exceptional. A bed that feels more stable becomes a standard to which others are compared. And with these shifting standards, the presence of fleas, once an unquestioned part of the night, begins to stand out in new ways, not as a constant background detail, but as something that contrasts with the possibility of something better. This contrast does not eliminate them, but it changes how they are experienced. And as that experience continues to evolve, it draws the story forward, toward a moment when the accumulation of small, deliberate changes begins to reach a point where the environment itself starts to feel different. Not just in isolated households, but across wider parts of society, where the quiet negotiation of medieval nights is slowly giving way to a new understanding of what rest might become. But even as that broader understanding begins to take shape, it does not arrive evenly, nor does it replace the old experience all at once. Instead, it creates a layered reality. In some households, the night begins to feel different, slightly more settled, slightly more predictable, shaped by habits that have been refined over time. In others, the older patterns persist with the same rhythms of interruption, the same quiet negotiations between body and environment. And often, these two realities exist side by side. A single town might contain both. A traveler might move between them within the span of a few days, noticing differences that are subtle, but increasingly distinct. One bed feels calmer, another more active. One room seems to hold its air in a way that allows the body to relax more easily, while another feels heavier, more resistant to rest. These differences are not yet dramatic enough to define entire regions, but they are noticeable enough to shape perception. And perception, once sharpened, begins to influence expectation more strongly. A person who has experienced a more settled night does not forget it. Even if they return to less comfortable conditions, they carry that memory with them, a sense that something else is possible, even if it cannot yet be fully achieved. This memory changes how discomfort is felt. It introduces a quiet comparison that was not always present before. A bite that might once have been accepted without much thought now feels slightly more intrusive. A restless night feels more distinct when placed against the memory of a calmer one. And this distinction encourages further attention. People begin to look more closely at the details of their environment, not just in response to discomfort, but in anticipation of it. They notice how long bedding has been left undisturbed. They become aware of how clothing feels after several days of wear. They pay attention to the air within a room, whether it moves, whether it feels fresh or stagnant. These observations are still informal, still grounded in lived experience rather than structured knowledge. But they are becoming more consistent. And as they become more consistent, they begin to influence behavior in ways that are increasingly deliberate. A person might choose to sleep in a slightly different position within the room, not out of habit, but out of a sense that it feels better. They might adjust the layering of their bedding with more intention, experimenting quietly, almost unconsciously, with what produces the most stable rest. These small experiments are rarely recognized as such. They do not feel like innovation, but they represent a form of problem-solving that is deeply embedded in daily life. And over time, these small acts of problem-solving begin to accumulate. They create a kind of distributed knowledge, a shared understanding that exists not in books or formal instruction, but in the repeated actions of many individuals across many households. This knowledge spreads through observation. A person visiting another home might notice a difference in how bedding is handled or how a room is arranged. They might not ask directly, but they remember. They carry that detail with them, and in time they may try it themselves. This is how change continues to move, quietly, incrementally, through the network of everyday life. At the same time, larger forces are beginning to amplify these patterns. As towns expand and social structures become more complex, the management of domestic space takes on new importance. Households are not only places of rest, but also of work, storage, and social interaction. The need to organize these functions more effectively begins to influence how space is used, even within the constraints of existing buildings. Sleeping areas, where possible, are given slightly more definition. Not always through physical walls, but through arrangement, through the positioning of beds, the use of fabrics, the separation of certain activities from others. These distinctions are subtle, but they matter. They allow for a greater degree of control over the immediate environment of the bed, even if the broader space remains shared and porous. And within this more defined space, the effects of small improvements become more noticeable. A bed that is aired regularly, positioned carefully, and maintained with attention begins to feel different. Not completely free from disturbance, but more stable, more predictable. And that predictability changes the experience of sleep. It allows the body to settle more quickly. It reduces the need for constant adjustment. Creates a rhythm that feels, if not entirely smooth, then at least more consistent. But once again, this improvement exists within limits. Fleas do not disappear. They continue to move through the same networks, through clothing, through shared spaces, through the constant flow of people and materials that defines medieval life. A well-managed bed may still be affected by conditions beyond its control. A visitor, a shared garment, a shift in weather, all can alter the balance. And so the experience remains dynamic. Some nights feel closer to rest as it might be imagined, calmer, more continuous. Others return to the familiar pattern of interruption, of small adjustments, of a body negotiating its way through the night. This variability becomes part of the expectation, not as a failure of improvement, but as a reflection of the environment's complexity. And within that complexity, people continue to refine their responses. They develop a more nuanced understanding of what can be influenced and what cannot. They learn where effort produces results and where it reaches its limits. This understanding is practical, grounded, and often unspoken. It shapes behavior in quiet ways, guiding decisions that, over time, contribute to a gradual redefinition of comfort. And as this redefinition takes hold, it begins to influence something deeper still. Not just how people sleep, but how they imagine sleep itself. What it means to rest. What it feels like to be undisturbed. What conditions are necessary for the body to settle fully. These ideas do not change all at once. They evolve slowly, shaped by experience, by comparison, by the accumulation of small improvements that, taken together, begin to suggest a different possibility. A night that is not defined by constant negotiation. A bed that feels less like an environment to manage and more like a place of rest. And as that possibility begins to take form, Even if only faintly, it draws the story forward, toward a moment when the quiet, persistent presence that has shaped medieval nights for so long will begin to be understood in a new light, not just as an unavoidable part of life, but as something that can, with enough change, be pushed further to the margins of the human experience. But before that possibility can fully take shape, there is a long stretch of time in which the old and the new exist, together, sometimes uneasily, sometimes almost indistinguishably. Because even as expectations begin to shift, reality does not immediately follow. A person may now imagine a more settled night, may recognize the conditions that support it, may even take deliberate steps to achieve it, and still find themselves lying awake, aware of the same small, familiar disturbances. This gap between expectation and experience is subtle, but it changes the emotional texture of the night. Where once there was simple acceptance, there is now, at times, a quiet awareness of limitation. Not frustration in the modern sense, not a sharp sense of something being wrong, but a recognition that the environment is still only partially within reach. And this recognition deepens the process of observation. People begin to notice not just what works, but when it works and when it does not. A method that seemed effective in one season may lose its impact in another. A habit that produced improvement in one space may feel less effective in a different setting. These inconsistencies become part of the experience. They remind the observer that the environment is not fixed, that it responds to factors that are not always visible or predictable. And within this variability, attention becomes more refined. Instead of looking for a single solution, people begin, again quietly, informally, to combine approaches. Bedding is aired and rearranged. Clothing is managed more carefully. Spaces are opened and adjusted. These actions, taken together, begin to create a more layered response to the conditions of the home. And this layering matters, because it reflects a growing understanding that no single change is sufficient. That comfort, even in its most modest form, emerges from the interaction of many small factors. At the same time, this process begins to influence how time itself is used within the household. Certain moments of the day take on new significance. Morning, for instance, becomes not just a time of waking, but a time of resetting the environment. Bedding is lifted, shaken, exposed. The traces of the night are addressed before they can settle more deeply into the materials. Daylight becomes an ally not fully understood, but consistently valued. Its presence seems to alter the condition of things, to make them feel less heavy, less active. And so it is used, when possible, to refresh what will later be returned to the body at night. Evening, in turn, becomes a time of preparation. Clothing is adjusted, sometimes changed. The bed is arranged with a greater sense of intention. Small actions, repeated regularly, create a transition from the activity of the day to the relative stillness of the night. These temporal patterns, morning, day, evening, begin to shape the rhythm of life in more deliberate ways. And within that rhythm, the presence of fleas is no longer just a constant, but something that is responded to at different points in the cycle. This cyclical awareness adds another layer to the experience. That IT introduces a sense that conditions are not static, but evolving over the course of each day. And that evolution can be influenced, if not fully controlled. There is also a growing awareness of how the body itself interacts with the environment. Sweat, warmth, and movement all contribute to the conditions that fleas seem to prefer. A body that has worked hard during the day carries with it the residue of that effort: moisture, heat, the subtle changes that occur through labor. When that body enters the bed, it brings those conditions with it. And so, even if only in small ways, people begin to adjust their transition into rest. They may pause before lying down, allow the body to cool slightly, adjust their garments. These actions are not always conscious, not always consistent, but they reflect an emerging sensitivity to the connection between the body and its surroundings. And this sensitivity continues to deepen over time, not through formal knowledge but through repeated experience, through the quiet accumulation of nights that feel different from one another, of days that carry the effects of those nights forward. And within this accumulation, something else begins to take shape, a sense of preference, not just for comfort in the abstract but for specific conditions, a certain kind of bedding, a particular arrangement of space, a rhythm of care that produces a more stable experience of rest. These preferences, once formed, begin to guide behavior more strongly. They influence decisions about materials, about space, about daily routines. They shape how a household organizes itself, even within the same structural limits. And as these preferences spread through observation, through imitation, through the quiet sharing of experience, they begin to create a broader shift. Not a uniform change, not a complete transformation, but a gradual movement toward environments that are more responsive to human needs. And within these environments, the presence of fleas begins to feel increasingly out of place. Not because they are gone, but because the conditions that once supported them so easily are being, slowly and unevenly, altered. This alteration is not yet sufficient to remove them entirely, but it is enough to change their role, from an unquestioned part of the night to something that stands in contrast to what the night is beginning to become. And it is within that contrast that the story continues to unfold, because as expectations rise, even modestly, and as environments begin to respond, even imperfectly, the pressure for further change grows. Small improvements invite further refinement. Slight gains in comfort encourage continued effort. And over time, these pressures begin to intersect more directly with larger developments, changes in materials, in construction, in the organization of domestic life, that will begin to reshape the very foundation on which medieval sleep has rested for so long. And as those foundations begin to shift, the quiet presence that has followed us through this story will find itself in a world that is no longer entirely suited to its persistence, a world where the balance between human intention and environmental condition is starting, slowly, to tilt in a new direction. And when that balance begins to tilt, even slightly, it reveals something that had always been there, but rarely noticed in such a clear way: the difference between enduring a condition and shaping it. Because for much of the medieval experience, endurance was the default. The environment was something to live within, to adapt to navigate with patience and repetition. The presence of fleas, like so many other small discomforts, belonged to that category of things that could be managed, but not meaningfully changed. But now, as these small, deliberate improvements accumulate, that assumption begins to loosen. A person who has learned, through experience, that certain actions can reduce discomfort, even modestly, begins to approach the environment with a different kind of awareness. Not just, this is how it is, but this is how it behaves. And once behavior is observed, it can be anticipated. A bed left undisturbed for too long behaves in a certain way. A room that remains closed begins to feel heavier over time. Clothing worn repeatedly without attention carries something into the night that is difficult to ignore. These are not abstract ideas. They are patterns, grounded in repetition. And the recognition of pattern is what makes deliberate change possible, because it allows action to move ahead of discomfort. Instead of waiting for irritation to appear, a person begins to act in advance, lifting bedding before it feels stale, opening space before it feels confined, adjusting garments before they carry the full weight of the day into the night. These anticipatory actions are small, but they represent a meaningful shift. They transform the night from something that happens to the body into something that the body prepares for. And within that preparation, the presence of fleas begins to occupy a slightly different place. Still there, still persistent, but no longer entirely unpredictable. Their activity becomes something that can be influenced, never fully controlled, but shaped at the edges. And this shaping, even when partial, begins to accumulate into something more stable. A household that consistently prepares its environment begins to experience fewer extremes. The worst nights become less frequent. The best nights, though still imperfect, become more familiar. This familiarity creates a new kind of expectation. Not perfection, but consistency. A sense that the night will follow a pattern that is known, manageable, and, to some extent, reliable. And reliability in this context has a quiet but powerful effect. It allows the body to settle more fully. It reduces the need for constant vigilance. It creates a rhythm that supports deeper rest, even if that rest is still interrupted in small ways. At the same time, this growing stability highlights the differences that remain. A traveler moving between households may now experience a more pronounced contrast than before. One space feels settled, another unsettled. One bed offers a kind of predictable comfort, another returns to the older pattern of constant adjustment. These differences are no longer subtle. They are felt. And once they are felt, they become part of the broader conversation. Shared, observed, carried from one place to another. This is how the idea of improvement continues to spread. Not through formal instruction, but through lived comparison. A person who experiences a more stable environment may attempt to recreate it elsewhere. They may not fully understand what made the difference, but they remember the feeling, and they seek it again. This seeking drives further refinement. Practices are repeated, adjusted, combined. Some prove more effective than others. Over time, a set of habits begins to emerge that reflects a deeper understanding of how the environment responds. And as these habits become more widespread, they begin to intersect with changes in material culture in more visible ways. The production of textiles, for instance, continues to evolve. Fabrics become more varied in texture and density. Certain materials are favored not only for their appearance, but for how they behave in daily use, how they hold or release moisture, how easily they can be aired, how they feel against the skin over extended periods. These qualities, once secondary, begin to take on greater importance, because they influence not just comfort in a general sense, but the specific experience of rest. A surface that remains drier, that accumulates less residue, that can be refreshed more effectively. These small advantages begin to add up. They do not eliminate fleas, but they change the conditions in which fleas operate. And that change, even when partial, contributes to a gradual shift in the balance. At the same time, the structure of living spaces continues to adapt. As households grow more complex, as urban environments become denser, the need to organize space more deliberately becomes more apparent. Sleeping areas, where possible, are given clearer definition. Not always through permanent walls, but through arrangement, through the use of fabric, through the positioning of furniture, through the separation of certain activities from others. This separation is never complete. The environment remains connected, porous, influenced by the same broader conditions. But it introduces a degree of control that did not previously exist. And within that control, the experience of sleep begins to change in more noticeable ways. A bed that is set apart, even slightly, from the flow of daily activity begins to feel different, less disturbed, more contained. And in that contained space, the effects of careful preparation become more pronounced. The combination of aired bedding, managed clothing, and adjusted space creates an environment that, while still imperfect, offers a more consistent experience of rest. And within that consistency, the presence of fleas becomes more clearly defined. No longer a constant background condition, but something that appears more distinctly against a quieter setting. This clarity does not eliminate them, but it changes how they are perceived. They become more visible as a problem, not because they are new, but because the conditions around them have improved enough to make their presence stand out. And it is within this heightened awareness that the next stage of change begins to take shape. Because once something is clearly perceived as a problem, rather than simply a condition, it invites a different kind of response. Not just adaptation, not just management, but the possibility, however distant, of reduction. And as that possibility begins to enter the imagination, it sets the stage for further developments that will continue to reshape the environment, the habits, and the expectations of medieval life, gradually pushing the small, persistent presence we have been following into a world where it is no longer quite as at home as it once was. No longer quite as at home as it once was. And it is here, quietly, almost without a single defining moment, that the long story of medieval nights begins to resolve itself. Because what started as a simple, almost invisible part of daily life, the presence of fleas in the bed, in the fabric, in the rhythm of sleep, has gradually revealed something much larger. Not just how people slept, but how they lived with their environment. For centuries, that relationship was defined by acceptance and adaptation. The night was not expected to be perfect. It was expected to be managed. Rest was something negotiated between the body, the space, and the countless small conditions that could never be fully controlled. Fleas were part of that negotiation. They shaped how bedding was handled, how clothing was worn, how rooms were used, and even how sleep itself was understood. They contributed, in quiet and persistent ways, to a world where comfort was relative, and where the idea of a completely undisturbed night was almost unimaginable. But over time, something changed. Not suddenly, not completely, but steadily. People began to observe more closely, to compare experiences, to refine habits, to shape their surroundings, even within limits. Materials improved. Spaces were arranged more deliberately. Air, light, and routine were used with increasing awareness. And with each small adjustment, the balance shifted. Not enough to eliminate discomfort entirely, but enough to change expectations. A better night became possible, then familiar, then gradually something closer to normal. And as that happened, the presence of fleas began to move, not disappearing entirely, but receding from the center of the experience, becoming less defining, less constant, less accepted as an unavoidable part of rest. What had once been woven into the fabric of nightly life began, slowly, to be pushed toward its edges. And this is what makes the story so revealing, because it is not really a story about fleas. It is a story about how people, over generations, learned to live within their limits, and then, little by little, began to reshape those limits. Through patience, through observation, through small, repeated acts that never felt like transformation in the moment, but accumulated into something meaningful over time. If you imagine lying down in a medieval bed at the beginning of this story, the night would feel alive in a very particular way. Full of small interruptions, quiet adjustments, a body never fully at rest. By the end, that same act of lying down begins to feel different. Still imperfect, still connected to the wider world, but calmer, more stable, more predictable, closer in a quiet and gradual sense to what we now recognize as rest. And perhaps the most interesting part is how invisible that change would have felt to the people living through it. No single night marked the turning point. No single invention transformed the experience. It was the accumulation, the slow layering of awareness, habit, and material change that reshaped the night. The kind of change that only becomes clear when you step back and look across time. So the next time you settle into a quiet bed, in a room that feels still, controlled, and almost completely separate from the outside world, it's worth remembering that this kind of rest is not as simple or as timeless as it seems. It is the result of centuries of small adjustments, of nights that were not quite comfortable, of people who noticed, adapted, and slowly changed the conditions around them. And somewhere, deep in that long history, In the straw-filled mattresses and shared rooms of medieval Europe, in the quiet movement of something small and persistent beneath the surface, is where that story begins. If you found yourself drawn into this kind of quiet, layered history, you might let me know what detail stayed with you the most, or what part of the past feels hardest to imagine living through. And if you'd like to return to more of these slow journeys into the past, you're always welcome here, whenever the night feels long enough for another story.